The air in the closed-down prison wing hung thick and cold, a permanent resident that no amount of time or disuse could evict. Dust motes danced in the anemic shafts of light that bled through grimy, barred windows high above, illuminating nothing but the decay. I ran a gloved finger along a rusting cell door, tracing the faint etchings of a long-forgotten prisoner. This place, with its echoing silence and the scent of damp concrete, was where I often chose to meet. It cleared my head, stripped away the pleasantries of the outside world, and forced everyone involved to get straight to the point. A heavy boot scuffed behind me. User NL. Always picking the most charming locales. I didn't turn. Charming for whom, Inspector? My voice, even to my own ears, sounded like gravel. It has character. Unlike most interrogation rooms. The inspector, a man whose face was etched with the quiet weariness of too many sleepless nights, stepped into my peripheral vision. He held a worn leather briefcase, his grip tight around the handle. This isn't about an interrogation. It's about a ghost. My attention sharpened. A ghost, Inspector? I deal in flesh and bone, motive and opportunity. Not specters. Then you'll have your hands full with this one. He sighed, the sound heavy in the cavernous space. Dr. Alistair Finch. You know the name? I did. Finch, the renowned historian, the academic with the insatiable appetite for ancient texts, the collector whose private library rivaled some national institutions. What about him? Found dead this morning. In his study. The inspector paused, letting the words hang. Bullet to the head. Clean shot. And the Chronos Scroll is gone. I finally turned, my gaze piercing. A simple robbery homicide, then. Why bother me? Because, User NL, the inspector said, his voice dropping, the study was locked. From the inside. Every window latched, every bolt secured. No signs of forced entry. Not a scratch on the doorframe, not a speck of disturbed dust on the window sills. Finch was alone in the house. His security system, state-of-the-art, showed no breaches. A locked room. A missing priceless artifact. No apparent entry or exit. This wasn't a ghost, this was a puzzle box, meticulously crafted. You've checked the usual suspects? I asked, already knowing the answer. Of course. Family, colleagues, rivals in the academic world. All accounted for. No one could have gotten in or out. It's impossible. We've got a dozen uniformed officers scratching their heads, and the forensics team is baffled. They've found nothing. Absolutely nothing. He opened his briefcase, pulling out a handful of photographs. He handed them to me. I took them, my eyes scanning the glossy prints. Finch himself lay sprawled beside a grand mahogany desk, a pool of crimson staining the Persian rug beneath his head. His eyes were wide, fixed on some unseen point on the ceiling. There was a single bullet hole in his temple. No weapon was visible in the frame. No suicide note, the inspector confirmed, anticipating my thought. And no weapon found in the room. Forensics swept the place twice. I thumbed through the photos, the intricate locking mechanism of the heavy oak door, the unbroken glass of the leaded windows, the alarm panel showing armed status. Each image screamed the same message, impenetrability. It was a perfectly sealed tomb. The Chronos Scroll, I murmured, my gaze lingering on a bare spot on the desk where a display stand sat empty. Was it kept in a safe? No. Finch, being the eccentric he was, believed it needed to be accessible to his intellect. He kept it on that stand, under a glass dome, right there. The inspector pointed to the empty space in one of the photos. He enjoyed looking at it, apparently. considered it his muse. A historian, dead in his fortress of knowledge, his most prized possession vanished into thin air. The bullet, the locked room, the missing scroll, each element twisted into a knot that defied conventional unraveling. My mind, usually a quiet engine of observation, began to whir, sifting through the impossible details. "Take me to the residence, Inspector," I said, handing back the photographs. I sat in the passenger seat of the unmarked car, my gaze fixed on the passing scenery, but my mind was already in that study, peeling back layers of the impossible. The inspector had provided a terse summary of the preliminary findings, but the truth was, there were no findings. Only contradictions. The house itself was a formidable structure of red brick and gables, surrounded by a high wrought iron fence. Uniformed officers milled about the perimeter, their faces grim. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the faint metallic tang of dried blood, despite the efforts to air out the room. We went straight to the study. The door, now ajar, stood as a testament to the police's forced entry. I stepped across the threshold, my eyes taking in every detail. The room was exactly as pictured, but the photographs, I realized, were a pale imitation of the reality. The sheer solidity of the place, the weight of its defenses, was palpable. I moved slowly, deliberately, my senses alert. The faint scent of pipe tobacco still lingered, a ghostly echo of Finch himself. Dust motes danced in the light from the open curtains, but on the polished surfaces, everything seemed undisturbed. The desk, the bookshelves, the heavy velvet drapes, all appeared untouched, frozen in time. I knelt beside the victim, not to examine the body, that was for the medical examiner, but to observe the immediate surroundings. Finch's hand was curled loosely, his fingers almost brushing a small, ornate silver letter opener that lay on the rug, gleaming innocently. It hadn't been in the photos. I made a mental note. Then I rose and went to the windows. Double-paned, securely latched, and covered by thick, heavy drapes that had been pulled open by the police. No marks on the frames, no broken glass. I tested the latch myself, it was firm. Finally, I stood before the door. The inspector had explained how they'd had to force the reinforced frame. I ran my fingers over the splintered wood where the lock had been. The original mechanism lay on a nearby table, a formidable deadbolt and an additional security chain, both intact before their destruction. This was no amateur job, this was professional-grade security. I surveyed the room again, the empty display stand mocking me. A man shot dead, his most prized possession vanished, in a room sealed tighter than a vault. The impossible crime. It was here, staring me in the face, daring me to unravel its threads. A faint smile touched my lips. This was precisely why they called me. The grand Victorian residence loomed, a dark silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its Gothic spires and intricate ironwork seemed to mock the frantic activity below, a flurry of flashing blue lights and uniformed figures. The air, crisp and carrying the scent of damp earth, held a tension so thick I could almost taste it. I stepped out of the unmarked car, my trench coat flapping lightly in the breeze, and immediately felt the weight of the place. It wasn't just old, it felt heavy with secrets. The inspector met me at the imposing oak door, his face a grim mask. User NL. Glad you're here. The study is still secured. We've got the family and staff in the drawing room, keeping them separate. I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the polished facade, the meticulously kept gardens, the discreet security cameras tucked beneath eaves. Finch hadn't been careless. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was precise. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of shadowed hallways and ornate furnishings. Every surface gleamed, every rug seemed perfectly aligned. A testament to a life of ordered wealth, now violently disrupted. I bypassed the study for a moment, needing to gauge the human element first. Sometimes, the truth is less about the physical space and more about the psychological. The drawing room was opulent, a stark contrast to the drawn faces within. 3 figures sat stiffly, separated by vast stretches of antique furniture. The inspector introduced me, and I took a seat, observing them with an unblinking intensity that always makes people squirm. First was the heir, a man whose tailored suit seemed to chafe at his nervous energy. His eyes darted around the room, settling on me with a flicker of resentment. "This is all quite distressing, user NL," he stammered, his voice reedy. My uncle was a private man. To have his final moments so publicly scrutinized. "Understood," I said, my voice low. "Just trying to understand what happened. Where were you yesterday evening, say, between 7 and midnight?" He hesitated, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "I was at my club, an important dinner. I have witnesses, of course. Left around 10:30, went straight home." He spoke with a practiced ease, almost too rehearsed. "I saw my uncle last week. He seemed preoccupied with his research, as always. The scroll, I suppose." "The Chronos Scroll," I prompted. "Did he ever discuss its specific historical significance with you? Or its monetary value?" He scoffed. Uncle Alistair never spoke of money when it came to his artifacts. He was a purist. As for significance, it was just another ancient text to me. Old paper, really. Valuable, yes, but mostly to academics. He shifted, avoiding my direct gaze. He did mention a recent acquisition. Something related to a historical figure incarcerated in a closed-down prison wing centuries ago. Said he was trying to authenticate some related documents. That was interesting. A specific detail, almost thrown in as an afterthought. I filed it away. Next, I turned to the estranged niece, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a surprising depth of grief. She wore a simple black dress, her posture rigid. "He was my uncle," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Despite our disagreements, I loved him." "Disagreements?" I asked. "He disapproved of my career path," she admitted, a hint of defiance in her tone. "I'm an artist. He thought it frivolous, a waste of my intellect." She looked away. I hadn't seen him in months, not since the last family gathering. But I did call him last week. He sounded excited. "About a new discovery," he said. "Something that would shake the foundations of historical understanding." He wouldn't elaborate, just kept mentioning its unique encryption. Did he mention the Chronos Scroll specifically? Not by name. I gathered it was central to his excitement, she replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. He was always protective of his collection, especially that one. Said it was unique, unlike any other artifact he'd ever encountered. Unique encryption. That echoed the heir's old paper sentiment, but with a crucial difference. Finally, I spoke with the head housekeeper, a stoic woman with impeccably tied-back gray hair and a gaze that missed nothing. She'd served Finch for decades. The master kept to a strict routine, she answered, her voice clipped. Tea at 7, dinner at 8, then to his study until past midnight. Never deviated. Did anyone visit him yesterday evening? I inquired. She pursed her lips. No visitors. The house was quiet. I retired at 10. A pause, then a subtle flicker in her eyes. Though I did hear a faint scratching sound from the study around 11. Like something being moved quietly. I thought perhaps the master was rearranging his books. A scratching sound. Not a struggle, not a scream. Something quiet. And the scroll? I inquired. Was it always in the study? Always in its display case, yes, she confirmed, her gaze hardening. Never removed. The master valued it above all else. Said it contained a secret, a key to a lost language or something. Lost language. Unique encryption. Foundations of historical understanding. The Chronos Scroll was rapidly evolving from a valuable antiquity into something far more significant. My final interview was with Professor Elias Thorne, a rival academic Finch had frequently clashed with. Thorne was a portly man with a perpetually disgruntled expression, introduced by the inspector as having been loudly protesting his innocence at the station earlier. He sat hunched, radiating an air of intellectual superiority, even in grief. Alistair was a fool, Thorne declared, not bothering with pleasantries, but a brilliant one. He had the Chronos Scroll, yes. And he knew its true potential. It's not just an ancient text, user NL. It's a key. A Rosetta Stone for a forgotten civilization, believed to contain encrypted astronomical data that could rewrite our understanding of early celestial navigation. Finch was close to cracking it, I know he was. He even alluded to having found a preliminary cipher, something he said he stumbled upon while cross-referencing documents from that old closed-down prison wing he'd been researching. He claimed it held a crucial piece of the puzzle for the scroll's translation. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes glinting. That scroll, user NL, isn't just worth millions. It's worth a Nobel Prize. It's worth history itself. The pieces, disparate at first, were beginning to align. Finch wasn't just murdered for a valuable artifact, he was murdered for what that artifact represented. The heir saw money, the niece saw a personal connection, the staff saw routine. But Thorne, the rival, saw the immense intellectual power of the scroll. And he mentioned the closed-down prison wing again, linking it directly to Finch's recent breakthrough with the scroll. The old paper was anything but. The tension in the room, the house, was a tangible thing, a web of lies and half-truths, and I knew I was only just beginning to tug at the threads of deception. The hum of the city outside Finch's estate felt distant, a world apart from the quiet, unsettling rhythm of my thoughts. The rival, Thorne, sought intellectual power. That stuck with me. It wasn't just about the scroll's market value, which was substantial enough to tempt any opportunist. It was about what Finch had done with it, or what he intended to do. My initial assumptions, those neat little boxes I'd started to draw around the usual suspects, greed, revenge, simple theft, were dissolving. This case felt academic. And academic disputes, I'd learned, could be as vicious as any street brawl. My first stop for Finch's past was a contact I'd cultivated over years, an academic known for having an ear to the ground, and a rather pronounced disdain for the established order. We agreed to meet in a place where shadows were plentiful and eavesdropping difficult, a section of the old closed-down prison wing on the city's outskirts. It was a cavernous, echoing space, the air thick with the dust of forgotten lives and the scent of damp concrete. The perfect setting for whispered truths. User NL, the academic greeted me, his voice barely above a murmur, eyes darting around the decaying cell block. He was a wiry man, perpetually hunched, as if perpetually braced for a blow. I heard about Finch. Shocking. Though, perhaps, not entirely surprising to those who knew his. Specifically, anything to do with the Chronos Scroll. He shifted, kicking at a loose piece of plaster. Finch, bless his brilliant, misguided soul, became obsessed. He called it the Chronos Paradox. He believed the scroll wasn't just a historical document, but a multi-layered cipher, a key to an entirely new chronology of human history. Not just a reinterpretation, mind you, but a complete rewrite. He thought he could prove that major historical events, dates we take as gospel, were entirely wrong, based on a centuries-old misinterpretation of ancient texts. My eyebrows rose. A rewrite of history? That's ambitious. Ambitious, dangerous, and utterly ridiculed, the academic scoffed, a dry, bitter sound. Especially by Thorne. Thorne built his career on the very historical orthodoxy Finch was trying to dismantle. Finch's Chronos paradox was a direct assault on Thorne's life's work. Their feud was legendary, escalating into thinly veiled public insults and venomous private correspondence. Finch grew incredibly paranoid in the last year, convinced Thorne was trying to discredit him, steal his research, even sabotage his funding. Funding? I picked up on that. Was he financially strained by this research? Strained? He was sinking everything into it, the academic confirmed, his voice dropping further. He was funding obscure archaeological digs, hiring specialists to cross-reference his findings, even modifying his study's security system. Not just to protect the scroll from thieves, he'd say, but to control who could access his findings, who could see the scroll and truly understand its secrets. He spoke of a temporal lock, a system only he could fully operate, tied to specific astronomical alignments or historical dates he was researching. Sounded like madness, but he was serious. A temporal lock. That was a new wrinkle. Finch wasn't just protecting a valuable object, he was protecting a radical idea, and perhaps a specific method of accessing that idea. The locked room suddenly felt less about a physical barrier and more about an intellectual one. Leaving the closed-down prison wing, the academic's words echoed in my head. Finch's paranoia, his radical theory, the feud with Thorne, and that odd detail about the temporal lock. The pieces were still scattered, but they were taking on sharper edges. My next stop was the solicitor, a man whose office smelled faintly of old leather and desperation. He was a plump, harried individual, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden death of a client as prominent as Finch. The estate is complicated, user NL, the solicitor began, adjusting his spectacles. Dr. Finch was, shall we say, not a prudent investor. While his collection is immensely valuable, his personal finances were in disarray. He'd poured vast sums into various, shall we say, unconventional research grants. Debts accumulated. Significant ones. Far more than the estimated value of the Chronos Scroll could cover, even if it were sold. The heir, the niece, they stand to inherit little beyond a mountain of liabilities if his assets are liquidated to cover the debts. A heavy sigh escaped him. He seemed convinced that proving his Chronos paradox would not only secure his legacy but also, somehow, miraculously solve his financial woes. He spoke of a grand unveiling, a moment when the world would acknowledge his genius and his finances would be restored. This was a significant revelation. The heir and niece, previously motivated by simple inheritance, now had a much stronger, more desperate motive, to salvage what they could from a bankrupt legacy. Or perhaps, to prevent the financial ruin from ever becoming public. Back in Finch's study, the air was still heavy with the lingering scent of old paper and dust. I stood before the empty plinth where the Chronos Scroll had rested, the meticulously secured room mocking me with its perfect order. No forced entry. No obvious struggle. Just absence. I ran my gloved hand over the security panel near the plinth. It was a sophisticated system, multi-layered, biometric, and motion-sensitive. But the academic's words about Finch's temporal lock and access control kept cycling in my mind. Finch wasn't just worried about theft, he was worried about unauthorized understanding. I squatted, examining the base of the plinth, then the wall panel behind it. The main control unit was flush, seamless. But my fingers brushed against a barely perceptible seam along the lower edge of the panel, almost hidden by the skirting board. It wasn't a flaw in installation, it was a modification. A tiny, almost invisible access point, no wider than a hairline crack. It looked like a very specific, deliberate addition, perhaps a manual override, or a reset mechanism. But not for disabling the alarm from the outside. For activating or deactivating something specific from within the secure zone. My heart gave a sharp, unpleasant lurch. This wasn't a simple security bypass. This was an internal mechanism. Finch, in his paranoia, or his eccentric genius, had built a backdoor into his own fortress. A door that didn't let a thief in. But perhaps allowed a very specific kind of access once inside, or even allowed the system to be manipulated from within to appear locked after the fact. The killer didn't break in. They were let in, or they exploited a vulnerability Finch himself had engineered, perhaps a temporal lock that only someone intimately familiar with his radical theories, or with the man himself, could possibly understand and trigger. The crime scene wasn't a testament to a brute force entry, it was a testament to an intricate, intellectual deception. The mystery had just deepened considerably, twisting into something far more personal, far more calculated, than I had initially conceived. Back in Finch's study, the air, usually thick with the scent of aged paper and polished wood, felt charged with a different kind of energy now, the invisible weight of desperation. The discovery of the historian's impending financial ruin had twisted the entire landscape of the case. It wasn't just about the Chronos Scroll anymore, was it? A priceless artifact, yes, but its theft, especially from a man teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, suggested something far more complex than simple greed. I paced the worn Persian rug, my gaze sweeping over the meticulously arranged shelves, the heavy mahogany desk, the very spot where Finch had met his end. If the Nissan heir had known about the financial precipice, their motivation shifted dramatically. It wasn't merely about inheriting a fortune, it was about preventing a public humiliation, salvaging a name, perhaps even using the scroll to pay off the crushing debts before anyone was the wiser. The locked room, the missing artifact, it all began to look less like a straightforward robbery and more like an elaborate stage play, designed to distract from a far uglier truth. My fingers traced the spine of a dusty volume on ancient economies. Finch was a scholar, a man of intellect, but even scholars had bills and secrets. The more I considered it, the more I felt a gnawing certainty that the killer hadn't just taken the scroll, they had exploited Finch's desperate situation. I pulled out my notebook, flipping past my initial observations, the diagrams of the study, the details about the security system. I needed to re-evaluate everything through this new lens. Finch's recent activities. Had he been scrambling? Making unusual contacts? Desperate men often did desperate things. I remembered the assistant mentioning Finch's increasingly erratic schedule, his hushed phone calls. At the time, I dismissed it as academic eccentricity. Now, it screamed of clandestine dealings. A quick review of Finch's digital calendar, accessed through his secured workstation, a task that had taken me hours to bypass, revealed a series of cryptic entries over the last month. Not meetings with fellow historians or museum curators, but vague appointments marked only with initials and locations I didn't recognize. One, in particular, stood out, M.V., West Wing, 3 p.m. This entry repeated several times, always on a Tuesday, always at 3 p.m. West Wing felt too generic to be an actual building wing. I cross-referenced it with a map of the city's lesser-known landmarks, searching for anything that might fit. And then it clicked. There was a section of the old city, a forgotten district, where a massive, imposing structure stood derelict. A structure once known for its formidable West Wing. The old, closed-down prison wing. Why would Finch, a renowned historian, be frequenting a crumbling, disused correctional facility? My mind raced. Was he researching something? Or was he meeting someone there? The image of the Chronos Scroll, an artifact of immense value, flashed in my mind. A secret meeting place for a secret transaction, perhaps? The financial records had painted a picture of a man drowning in red ink. Selling off his most prized possession in a clandestine location made a terrifying kind of sense. I grabbed my coat. The study, once a place of quiet contemplation, now felt suffocating. The answers, I suspected, lay in the chill, echoing corridors of that abandoned place. The drive to the closed-down prison wing was a descent into a forgotten corner of the city. Weeds pushed through cracked pavement, and the air grew heavy with the smell of damp concrete and decay. The building itself loomed, a monstrous silhouette against the gray sky, its broken windows like vacant eyes. The West Wing was a particularly grim section, its barbed wire fences long rusted, its guard towers crumbling. I found an unsecured service entrance, a heavy steel door hanging ajar, groaning on its hinges. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water and my own footsteps echoing through the vast, empty halls. The air was frigid, carrying the faint, metallic tang of old iron. I navigated by the beam of my flashlight, dust motes dancing in the narrow cone of light. Cell blocks stretched into the gloom, row upon row of open, empty cells, each one a testament to forgotten lives. I followed what I believed to be the path to the West Wing, consulting the faded blueprints I'd managed to dig up online. My breath plumed in the cold. And then I saw it. Tucked away in a corner of what might have been a former guard station, half hidden beneath a pile of rubble and broken glass, was a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't Finch's usual meticulous academic notes, this was a personal diary, its pages filled with frantic, almost illegible script. The entries were a flood of despair. Finch detailed his escalating debts, the pressure from creditors, his desperate attempts to secure a buyer for the last resort, a clear reference to the Chronos Scroll. But interspersed with the financial woes were references to a blackmailer, someone who knew about a past indiscretion, a transgression Finch had committed decades ago, something that would destroy his reputation entirely. The blackmailer wasn't demanding money, at least not directly. They were demanding access. He had been meeting this individual, identified only by the initials M.V., here, in this closed-down prison wing. Insists on the exchange. My life for my secret. I will try to resist. But the clock. This wasn't just about money or a stolen artifact. This was about a secret so damning it overshadowed even financial ruin. The killer hadn't just taken it, they had forced Finch to bring it here, to this desolate place, for some twisted purpose. As I stood there, the journal clutched in my hand, a faint scraping sound echoed from the corridor behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. It was the niece. I saw my car outside. I thought I should check. I could ask her the same thing, I responded, my voice cutting through the heavy air. This isn't exactly a popular tourist destination. Unless I had a reason to be here. A reason connected to my uncle. I held up the journal. Perhaps I recognize this? Her eyes fixed on the worn leather. Her composure, which had been fragile at best, shattered completely. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. That's his private journal. He kept it hidden. I didn't know he still had it. He was being blackmailed, I stated, letting the words hang in the air between us. For a secret he clearly thought was worse than death. And he was meeting his blackmailer here, in this very wing, repeatedly. He was desperate, wasn't he? Not just for money, but to keep that secret buried. Her shoulders slumped. A single tear tracked a path down her cheek. He was terrified for months. He wouldn't tell me what it was, only that it would ruin everything. Our family name, his legacy. He said he was going to meet the person, try to reason with them one last time. He said he had no choice but to bring the scroll. Not to sell it for money, but to keep his secret safe. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Finch hadn't been murdered for the scroll as a simple theft. He had been murdered because he was forced to bring it to a clandestine meeting, a desperate exchange, where his secret and his life were on the line. The locked room, the impossible crime, it was all designed to obscure the true nature of the meeting and the motive behind the fatal encounter in this very wing. And the niece, standing before me, knew more than he was letting on. The revelation from the previous night had been a cold splash of water on my face, cutting through the fog of assumptions. Finch wasn't a victim of simple robbery. He was a pawn, forced into a corner, his life hanging on a desperate exchange. The missing Chronos Scroll wasn't the prize, it was the lever. I stood in my cluttered office, the scent of stale coffee and old paper thick in the air. The pieces, once scattered and seemingly disparate, began to snap together with a chilling clarity. The note, the frantic calls, the meticulous security of Finch's study, it all pointed to one thing: Finch had a secret. A big one. And someone else knew it. Someone who wanted it buried permanently. The locked room wasn't an impossible feat of magic. It was a calculated act of betrayal, leveraging Finch's own meticulous nature against him. Finch, the renowned historian, the collector of secrets and artifacts, wouldn't have just a regular study. He'd have a sanctuary, a fortress. And what does a man like that value more than security? Knowledge, and the means to protect it. I remembered the subtle incongruity in the study. A section of the bookshelf, slightly deeper than the rest, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. A faint draft I'd dismissed as an old building's quirk. Finch hadn't just collected artifacts, he'd collected the means to hide them, and himself. He had a secret passage. Of course, he did. It was the only logical explanation for the locked room, for the killer's silent ingress and egress. But how did the killer know about it? How did they activate it? The answer clicked into place with a sickening certainty. The killer wasn't just an acquaintance, they were an intimate one. Someone who had shared a past with Finch, perhaps even helped him design or build that very passage. Someone who knew Finch's every habit, his every fear. The Chronos Scroll. Its name alone was a clue. Time. It wasn't just a historical document, it was a record. Finch had been a brilliant man, but perhaps not always an ethical one in his younger days. I imagined a young Finch, eager, ambitious, making a deal with the devil. And the Chronos Scroll was the receipt. The killer's motive solidified, to prevent the exposure of that shared secret, a secret so damaging it could ruin careers, reputations, perhaps even lives. Finch, burdened by guilt, or perhaps facing a new moral imperative, had decided to reveal it. And the scroll was his proof. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the keypad. I knew who it was. The hints were all there, subtly dropped in conversations, in nervous glances, in overly eager offers of assistance. The curator of the Regional Historical Society, a man whose polished demeanor barely hid a simmering ambition and a rigid adherence to reputation. He had been Finch's protégé decades ago, rising through the ranks, his career inextricably linked to Finch's early patronage. Their history was deep, tangled. And the curator had been too helpful, too knowledgeable about Finch's security, too quick to dismiss any theory that strayed from simple theft. He had a reputation to protect, one that Finch could shatter with the truth contained within the Chronos Scroll. The curator had called me earlier, feigning concern, suggesting we need to discuss some new leads he'd supposedly uncovered. He'd proposed a location, the old, closed-down prison wing on the city's outskirts. Said it was quiet, discreet, no prying eyes. I knew better. It was a place for control, for isolation, for finality. He wasn't looking for leads, he was looking for an opportunity. I arrived at the specified coordinates, the hulking silhouette of the closed-down prison wing looming against the bruised twilight sky. My boots crunched on gravel as I approached the main entrance, a rusted gate that groaned open like a dying beast. Inside, the echoing silence was punctuated only by the drip of unseen water. User NL? Is that I? The curator's voice, usually smooth and cultivated, sounded thin, reedy, bouncing off the concrete walls of the cavernous entrance hall. He stepped out from behind a support pillar, his silhouette sharp against the distant, grimy windows. He clutched a heavy briefcase, his grip tight. The Chronos Scroll, I surmised, was inside. "It's me," I added, my voice steady, betraying none of the tension coiling in my gut. I kept my hands visible, my posture relaxed, but my senses were on high alert. I said I had new information. Indeed. Very sensitive. Best discussed in private. He gestured further into the gloom, towards a corridor lined with empty cells, their barred doors hanging ajar like gaping mouths. "Follow me." I didn't move. "No need. We can talk here. I think I have all the information I need, actually." He stopped, his shoulders stiffening. "Oh? And what might that be?" His voice had lost its earlier pretense of cordiality, a brittle edge creeping in. "I know how Finch was murdered," I stated, my gaze unwavering. "And I know why." Then, a dry, humorless chuckle. "Do you now?" The great user NL, cracking the impossible. "Impressive, but you're wrong. It was a simple theft gone wrong. A common criminal, perhaps from the antiquities underworld. A common criminal wouldn't know about the secret passage behind the Elizabethan history section in Finch's study," I countered, watching his face closely. A flicker of something, surprise, fear, hate, anger, crossed his features before he regained his composure. "A common criminal wouldn't know the exact mechanism to open it. How to resecure it from the outside once they'd left with the Chronos Scroll." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the decaying space. "You're speculating." "Am I?" "Finch was forced to allow you into his study, wasn't he? You used your shared history, your intimate knowledge of his home, perhaps even a threat against something he held dear, to gain entry. He opened the secret passage, perhaps to retrieve the scroll, or perhaps to hide it. But you were faster. You killed him, took the scroll, the very evidence of your shared past, your dirty secret, and slipped out through that hidden route, leaving the main door locked and undisturbed. A perfect locked room, designed by Finch himself, turned into his tomb by his oldest confidant. His face was a mask of furious denial, but his hands trembled, betraying him. Madness. Finch was a reclusive man. No one knew about such a passage. "Except you," I pressed, stepping closer, the bright young protege who helped his mentor acquire those questionable artifacts decades ago. The Chronos Scroll wasn't just a valuable piece, it was a meticulously kept record, a ledger of your illicit dealings, detailing how you both acquired the Alexandrian obelisk. Finch was going to expose it all, wasn't he? Clear his conscience. And that would have brought down your carefully constructed empire of respectability. The curator's breath hitched. His eyes narrowed, burning with a desperate fire. He threatened everything, he hissed, the cultured veneer finally cracking. Everything I built. Here, in this forgotten place. He let out a guttural cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and fear. The briefcase clattered to the floor, spilling the ancient, rolled parchment of the Chronos Scroll onto the dusty concrete. In a flash, he lunged, not at me, but towards a rusty pipe jutting from the wall. My movements were faster. I sidestepped, my hand already reaching for the small, heavy object I always kept in my coat pocket. The sharp clang of metal echoed as his desperate grab met only empty air. "It's over," I answered, my voice cutting through the tension. The serpent has unmasked itself. A blur of instinct and honed reflexes. He didn't even manage to wrap his fingers around the rusty pipe before I was on him, a tackle. Low and hard that sent us both sprawling across the grimy concrete of the closed-down prison wing. The impact knocked the wind out of him, a choked gasp escaping his lips as his head bounced off the unforgiving floor. My knee found its purchase on his back, pinning him down, one hand twisting his arm behind him in a grip I knew wouldn't break. The fight drained out of him quickly, not with a whimper, but with a series of ragged, defeated breaths. He lay there, trembling, the fury that had possessed him moments ago replaced by a chilling stillness. I didn't loosen my hold until the inspector and his team burst through the heavy metal door, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, painting the scene in stark, flickering light. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and rust, a fitting backdrop for the unraveling of such a meticulously woven deception. "He's secured," I stated, my voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming beneath my skin. My eyes darted to the floor, to the rolled parchment of the Chronos Scroll, lying perilously close to a puddle of stagnant water. I released the killer into the custody of two burly officers, who wasted no time in cuffing him, their movements efficient and practiced. Then, with a carefulness usually reserved for ancient relics, I retrieved the scroll. It felt impossibly fragile in my hands, a testament to centuries of history, almost lost to a modern-day obsession. The killer, now restrained, simply stared at the ceiling of the closed-down prison wing, his face a mask of utter blankness. It was a peculiar kind of defeat, not one of remorse or even anger, but of a profound emptiness, as if the very purpose that had driven him had evaporated the moment the scroll slipped from his grasp. I watched him, a knot of unease twisting in my gut. He wasn't a monster, not in the traditional sense. He was a man consumed, warped by a hunger for intellectual validation and a twisted interpretation of legacy. He saw himself not as a thief, but as an inheritor, a rightful claimant to Finch's work, a natural successor to the historian's genius. The Chronos Scroll was merely the ultimate validation of that claim. The inspector approached, his expression a mixture of relief and weary satisfaction. "Good work, user NL. Another one for the books. How did you know he'd be here?" "A hunch, primarily," I admitted, my gaze still fixed on the killer. He always wanted to be seen as Finch's equal, perhaps even his superior. Finch's private writings spoke of a secret vault for his most treasured possessions, a place known only to him and a select few. The killer, having meticulously catalogued Finch's life, likely stumbled upon obscure references, perhaps in Finch's early letters, to this forgotten place. A place where he could feel truly alone with his inheritance. This closed-down prison wing, derelict and forgotten, yet still imposing, spoke to a certain grandiosity, a private kingdom for a private obsession. The inspector grunted, signaling his team to lead the killer out. As he was pulled to his feet, the killer finally met my gaze. There was no defiance, no malice, just a quiet, almost mournful acceptance. It was a look that confirmed my earlier deductions. This wasn't about simple greed. It was about a legacy, stolen and then reshaped, a narrative crafted to replace another. He'd meticulously studied Finch's habits, his home, his every vulnerability, not just to steal, but to become Finch in a twisted, intellectual succession. The locked room, the seemingly impossible disappearance of the scroll, it had all been a performance, a grand, theatrical gesture to prove his intellectual superiority, a puzzle designed to be unsolvable, a final, mocking tribute to the man he both admired and resented. He'd used an old, rarely used service tunnel that connected to Finch's study, a structural anomaly he'd discovered during his extensive research into the building's history, a detail Finch himself had likely long forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant. He'd then sealed it from the inside, making the room an impenetrable tomb. Later that evening, after giving my full statement and ensuring the Chronos Scroll was safely handed over to the appropriate authorities for preservation and eventual public display, I found myself back in the quiet solitude of my own office. The city hummed outside, a stark contrast to the echoing silence of the closed-down prison wing. The scroll would be safe, its ancient wisdom protected. Finch's estate, I learned from a brief call with the estate lawyer, was being handled, a complex web of academic bequests and family trusts that would take months, if not years, to untangle. Finch's legacy, despite the tragic end, would endure. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was an email, the subject line stark and intriguing, urgent inquiry, the vanishing architect. I opened it, my eyes scanning the brief, enigmatic message. Another puzzle. Another life tangled in a web of secrets and unanswered questions. The world was full of them, I reflected, each one a testament to the bewildering complexity of human desire, fear, and ambition. And as long as there were mysteries, there would be someone like me, sifting through the echoes, seeking the truth in the aftermath. I leaned back in my chair, a faint smile touching my lips. My journey, it seemed, was far from over.